I've asked Phil Pister to do this seminar long before I knew he was going to win this award, and it's just coincidental that he won this award literally like Friday night and is doing the seminar tonight. The award is the 2018 Andrea Mead Lawrence Award that he was presented with on Friday night. So we're celebrating Phil. This is the continuation of Phil Fest. We got a cake, and the long and short story of the cake is Annie and I had to do a little redecorating of the cake. So we got the cake at Vaughn's. I said, hey, can you write, congratulations, Phil, Andrea Mead Lawrence Award winner on the cake, and can you do a pupfish on the cake? And they looked at me like, we don't know what a pupfish is. So I said, how about just a fish? Can you put a fish on the cake? Figuring that would be good. And then we got the cake. We picked up the cake. Not only was everything spelled wrong, but there was a giant. Now, Phil, guess what kind of fish they put on a cake when I asked for just a fish? No, they put a largemouth bass on your cake. And I was like, your great enemy. That's why I was like, we have to scrape this off the cake. So Annie and I did some surgery and smeared the frosting around and put some gummy fish on there, and it looks like it never happened, but we didn't want to do that to Phil. So I just want to also say a few words about this award. A couple years ago, Dan Dawson and Leslie Dawson won this award, and I went to the dinner and I learned a lot about this woman, Andrea Mead Lawrence, and I just think it's worth thinking about who she was and what she stood for. She was an amazing woman. She was multiple gold medal skier. In a time when there were not that many female athletes, here she is on the cover of Time magazine, 1952. So she was doing big, amazing things back then. So she was a great skier, and not only was she a great skier, what we're really celebrating about Andrea Mead Lawrence in this award too is the contributions that she made here locally. She held office in Mono County and was really responsible for a lot of important environmental legislation. So her legacy lives on, and she fought a lot of hard battles to do what she did. Here's a great picture of her showing just how determined that woman looks. And I think it's really fitting that somebody like her, or Phil, is honored in her legacy, because I think Phil is somebody who really stands for that sort of determination to fight hard fights and to support the environment and do what's right for the environment. That's largely what Phil's going to be talking about tonight, is the ethics of environmental conservation. For those of you who don't know Phil's background, he started here actually at SNARL in 1950. He did work, most of the original work up in the Convict Lakes Basin. And one of the papers he's published on that is the first ever scientific publication that's come out of SNARL. Really seminal work. And then he's gone on to become really a champion for environmental causes in this area, for fisheries biology. He has, you've probably heard the stories about Phil and his fights to save the Owens pupfish, golden trout, the golden trout wilderness, and the Devil's Hole pupfish. So Phil is someone who has really been instrumental in this kind of work. Also, importantly to us, Phil is, he's one of the founding fathers of SNARL. So back in a time when SNARL was kind of abandoned and was going to be turned over as federal surplus property, it was Phil who made the call to Roger Samuelson at the University of California and said, this place is going to go away if someone doesn't do something, and we think it's valuable, we think it's worth saving, and Phil made that happen. So we honor Phil and thank Phil for doing all that, and we're here to celebrate Phil, so get your fill of cake. We're going to listen to Phil and philosophy of Phil on environmental ethics. And so at this point, I'm going to end that and turn it over to Phil and let him speak.
Thank you, Carol. You know, my mind goes back to working with Andrea when she was on the Board of Supervisors. For a long time, it still exists, but for a long time, people couldn't understand why the Department of Fish and Wildlife or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the university was concerned with little creatures that don't make any money. Unfortunately, this was true of the Board of Supervisors in Mono County. But I learned right off that Andrea and I could see eye to eye on these things. So when I needed help through government sources, Andrea understood this and was really a wonderful helper in the work that we did. If we needed money to do something, she was always there to speak on our behalf. Not all the supervisors felt that way, although there were a couple of three that did. Tim Alpers was always good this way. Okay, so that's Delaware State. That's an interesting thing. I got a good friend in the faculty back there. Says, come on out to Delaware. You can give a seminar there. Well, it's the most interesting school, heavily populated with minorities of all kinds. And I found out very quickly after talking with the kids there that, gosh sakes, what's this? That's more than 10 years ago, that color makes no difference in brain power at all. About 50% of the kids there at Delaware State are black. And talking with them after the seminar, you could get a good insight into how they thought and what they were doing, particularly graduate students. They were excellent. So with that, we'll go on now. Much of what I'll talk about tonight was brought about by my very fortunate association at UC Berkeley with Starker Leopold. That's Aldo Leopold's eldest son. And I was so fortunate there to have Starker to guide me through 7 years there at Berkeley, both undergraduate and graduate work. And he was just a marvelous guy. And it gave me a kind of an opening to go back to Wisconsin, Baraboo, and tour the Leopold estate back there. And, you know, after we read this book and spent with Starker for a long, long time, I could hardly take a step back there without bursting into tears. Same problem exists now. It brings back all this flood of memories. We were on a field trip with Starker one time up into the deer country over on the west side, Cherry Valley in that area. And I had just received an offer from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which at that time ran SNARL. And they said, you can have a job if you want to. So I said, you bet. So I got a hold of Starker. I said, Starker, I have this opportunity. Should I take it? He said, by all means. Said, you may not be deer, but the fish are just as important. And went on from there. There's only one, Leopold's had 5 children. Only one is still living, Estella, who's a professor of paleobotany at the University of Washington in Seattle. Another just wonderful lady. So, okay. What Starker taught us, and me in particularly, was our responsibilities to future generations, which is really what conservation is all about. It's not for the living, it's for those yet to come. And he did this so well and so profoundly that those lessons never left me. What we have here then is a combination of 4 words, ethics, which is part of conservation, which is part of biology, part of biodiversity. These three things, or four things, come together very profoundly in a natural circumstance. I don't have to tell you how wonderful our area is here on the east side. It's hard to believe that you go from the top of Mount Whitney at 14,495 feet, or somewhere near there, to the floor of Death Valley below sea level. One time at Whitney Portal, I had lunch at Whitney Portal, and a couple of hours later, I was at the lowest point in the United States, at Badwater in Death Valley. And it's just absolutely amazing things. These are such marvelous bits of nature that one of the reasons I give these talks is so it becomes more part of your thinking as well as mine. This is Upper Convict Creek. That's Red Slate Mountain, Lake Constance in the lower left. And when you think of a lake like that, Lake Constance, you normally think of a fish like golden trout. Yet you can go across Death Valley, a place called Cotton Ball Marsh, and you find these little guys, little pupfishes, which are more at home there in floor of Death Valley than they would be in mountains or anywhere else. This is where they evolved. Okay, here comes a common denominator then. Huge numbers of people in Southern California, which is fine. It's good that they're there. And many of them appreciate what we have here. You can tell that on the opening of fishing season or any other major holiday. People are swarming up from down there to come up here. Well, okay, my job when I went to work for the state, I started in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here at SNARL. In 1952, they had some huge budget cuts in federal service, and I had to get a job somewhere with the family. So I went down to Bishop and got a job with the State Department of Fish and Game, which is now Department of Fish and Wildlife. So on that opening of weekend of opening of fishing season, while there swarms of people are out fishing for trout, there will be another biologist type wandering out through Salt Creek in Death Valley. Many things in common here. What brings us to a discussion of values. Let's assume that there's a family residing on the shore of the Mississippi River during spring floods. Water's getting higher and higher. So they get the family together, load them into the station wagon, and begin to go to their home, which they know is going to be flooded before long. And they have a choice of several things they can take. One of them here is the old family Bible. It holds the birth records of that family for several hundred years. Literally irreplaceable. Or they can take the video games that the kids have put together. So in order not to be too authoritative, the family gets together and they say, okay, what do you want to take? Kids say, oh, we want to take the family or the video games because we babysat and mowed lawns and stuff to buy them. And parents with the wisdom of ages say, no, we're going to take the Bible because there are values there that cannot be replaced any other way. And they knew that the kids sooner or later, in several years, would understand their rationale for doing that. This doesn't show up very well. I'll go on to the next one. Just across Death Valley, on the Nevada side, Nye County, is a place called Ash Meadows. Ash Meadows is a marvelous place. It has these springs that have been there since the end of the Pleistocene, where the fishes all at one time were the same. Then, as it dried up, the fish were left in various pockets. And through geographic isolation, turned into different species and subspecies. In a way, reflecting Charles Darwin's thinking of where the finch populations in the Galapagos Islands were different, just not much different, but enough different to give them different species, different specific designations. And the pupfishes show these same reflections of geographic isolation. Marvelous examples of that. One of the more critical places that I've had to work in past years, even though it's in Nevada, and I worked for California, was a place called Devil's Hole. It's been in the news some in the last few months. People broke into the security fences they had around Devil's Hole and defaced Devil's Hole. They killed some of the fish and created a big mess. The Fish and Wildlife Service luckily had monitoring cameras to watch all this stuff. And I guess both the federal government, their law enforcement people, and also the Nevada Department of Wildlife and others, were able to track them down. They're going to be in jail for quite a while. They're in violation of the Endangered Species Act, which I hope we could continue to have. The Trump administration doesn't necessarily agree with what we're talking about here. And I say that sadly, but we're going to have a big fight before this is all over with. We have good guys and bad guys in this business. Here's a bumper sticker from one of the good guys. But outside of some of the bars there in that Ash Meadows area, you have these. And they're both equally committed to their cause. Because when we went to save Ash Meadows and Devil's Hole, it meant cutback in some of the agriculture in that area, which is one of the major sources of income for the people there. Luckily, we've so far been able to conduct both. Not too sure how long that'll last. So what do? We got this battle going on. This is the Interior building in Washington. And went to the U.S. Supreme Court about who owns the water under federal land. The states historically have said it's our water, states' rights. The federal government said, no, that water belongs to the federal government. So after some time, went to the Supreme Court, and we won that battle on an 8-0 judgment of the U.S. Supreme Court. The federal government then retained the water under Devil's Hole, which was the habitat of this fish. Over the Supreme Court building in D.C. is a chiseled out of the granite saying equal justice under law. And it was good to know that we could get some measure of that equal justice for little fish that when they're big ones are about an inch long. This brings us to the matter of values. That's what we'll be talking about for much of the rest of the discussion this evening. There's a little Devil's Hole pupfish. A big one is 20 millimeters, which is about 3/4 of an inch. But they've learned to live with what nature provides, and they do quite well with it now. We hope we can keep them alive. What happened then, the way I have some optimism here, is that the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, was able to work out a land exchange so that the developer guy could have land, but the critical desert habitats where the fish live became part of the National Wildlife Refuge here. So that's good to know that we have these areas where fish and wildlife, or particularly fish in this case, get that recognition that they so badly need. One of the most interesting things that I ever ran across in my job, working out of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for many years. Started work for them in 1952 and retired in 1990 and still working for them without pay, of course. That's okay. You have a cause here that you work for. At one time, all of the Owens pupfish were located in this pond in Fish Slough, just out of Bishop a ways. There's the Owens pupfish, one of the larger ones. That's about 2 inches long. All of this was brought together in a book several years ago called Battle Against Extinction. That was put out about in the late 80s. And we're redoing it now, be volume 2, bringing out mainly with things I'm talking about tonight, the values of these creatures. This is written by a guy with the LA Times. I've answered this question myself probably close to 1,000 times. One time I was out at the Bishop Golf Club having lunch, and we were muddy. We just came in from Fish Slough, and a lady that runs a business there in Bishop, there's one chair left. She wanted to sit there. I said, fine. What are you guys doing? I said, well, we're out of Fish Slough trying to save some little fish out there. Her response is probably not too atypical for people in the United States. Do they make money for anybody? No, they don't. The values are inherent, and if you have to ask that question, you probably won't understand the answer. One of the best answers I've come up with when people say, what good are they? My response is, what good are you? It seems a little bit crass in a way, yet it's a very good question. We're all life forms on the same planet. So what good are these little fish? Well, what good are you? It works. Try it sometime. This whole matter of environmental philosophy goes back, back in Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. It's where Gifford Pinchot, who started up the Forest Service, came up with really a great statement. You manage resources for the greatest good for the greatest number over the longest period of time. That's okay, but then you have to say, what is the value of these different things? That's Harkness Tower. I walked up in that thing. It's the highest building without any reinforced steel. And all I could think of being from California, good Lord, this is the last trip I'm going to make in my life. That's called Harkness Tower. There's Pinchot. But along with you go into the Sage Hall, which is the big building where they turn out people in resource management there at Yale. The other guy that you run into is Aldo Leopold. Leopold had a very different view of this. To him, the greatest good for the greatest number would be depending on what your thinking is. Yeah, Pinchot's is more of what you might expect from a resource manager to produce a product. But for a guy like Aldo Leopold, he just viewed human beings as another life form on the planet, which is probably a pretty good analysis of this whole thing. What makes us any more valuable than little fish or a bird or something like that? Along with that same group of thinkers was one of the really great ones. See if you remember who that would be. That's Rachel Carson, who is one of the real pioneers in this business. And her Silent Spring was a real eye-opener way back when she got people to thinking about the value of land and water and people all together. This is, to me, an interesting thing. It's the evolution of ethics. That's what we're talking about tonight. So you start in here at the bottom, the individual. It's okay. But then all of a sudden the old caveman decides, geez, probably should take part of this mastodon and feed the family with it. Then that expands it into the tribe, into the region, the nation, the race. Mankind, mammals, all life, environmental origins and values. The environment, of course, brings all of this together. And that's why it's so hard. You know, we're pretty hard on President Trump with good reason. The guy, I kind of go along with Colin Powell on this, that Donald Trump is a national disgrace. And I think that's true. But what we have here then is a set of values, starting with the number one, us, or me, then up through family, clear up to environment, the rights of rocks, where we're getting to now. Aldo Leopold, in his very famous Sand County Almanac, summed all this up so well. If any of you here in this room have not read this book, you owe it to yourself to get a copy. Get it for $4.95 in paperback. Some of the most wonderful writing is found in Sand County Almanac. I have a good friend at the University of Wisconsin who put out another book called Companion to a Sand County Almanac of essays built around this original here. This was published in 1948. Aldo Leopold died in 1948. He died fighting a neighbor's grass fire. He had a bad heart anyway. That's what got his son, Starker, my friend, in 1983. He passed on. Okay, the land ethic. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens, that's us, from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. That's one of the first statements of ecology, bringing human beings into it, that was published. And it's certainly so true. I might add, that's from the southern end of Saline Valley, northern end of Saline Valley looking south on a spring day. Well, what happened in our country? Why did people lose these interests and these values? Probably started with technology. We went from the era of the stagecoach to the jet airliner almost overnight before we really understood what we were doing. That's why it's frightening to me to see so many of our younger people, particularly our kids in their teens and below that, so tied up with electronic devices. How many of them get out and see nature? A friend of mine wrote a book on this subject called The Last Child in the Woods. And he did some studying on this, and he went to different groups and asked the kids there, different schools, if you had a choice of spending a day out in the woods or a day in a hotel, which would you take? Well, we'd go to the hotel because that's where the electrical outlets are. Well, we're losing our touch with these natural things. I hope we retain them for a while. What we have here then is the arrogance of humanism, where we think that what we do is the best. David Ehrenfeld is a professor at Rutgers back in New Jersey, very good thinker. We've lost this reverence for the land that this old couple, probably in France, bowing their heads as the church bells toll in their village, giving thanks to the land for all that it gives them, everything they have. We find people that are having trouble adapting to these ideas. You go to the California desert, down in Mojave area, anywhere out in the desert, and here comes a bunch of guys with dirt bikes and ATVs. Well, that is okay. But what really hurts is the next morning, on a Monday morning after the weekend's over, you find this. Can you imagine anybody being that cruel or that crass? To take some totally defenseless little creature like a desert tortoise and kill it by shooting it with a .22 pistol. Sometimes you can't help but be a bit cynical. This is a professor back in the Rockies, philosophy prof, we've taught our children by precept and example that every living thing exists to be converted into cash. And converted into cash. And that whatever would not yield a return, that monetary return, should be quickly exterminated to make way for creatures that do. I don't know, it's going to take a lot of education. Our nation particularly is so tied up in making money. It's hard for them to see values beyond that. You can walk down a mountain trail. There's a trail from up in the upper part of Big Pine Creek down to the town and see this beautiful butterfly. And you look up to where we came from and you see the Palisades up there. Beautiful mountains. If you really want to get a good perspective on this, take a look at the planet Earth across the moon, one of the early moon shots. And I think every one of us here in the room, our friends or your friends, would do well to once in the summertime lay out a blanket on the lawn and look up and think, where do I fit into all this? When Stephen Hawking died the other day, we lost one of our great minds for this sort of thing. We're going to miss that man. We could go now from the fall out of Bishop in the Owens Valley, see that beautiful cottonwood tree. Fall, summer and winter comes along, the leaves are gone now. Then they come back again. Beautiful. And then we're back to winter. And we realize, looking at this, that we are not just observing it, we're part of it. This is a fellow named Alfred Russel Wallace, one of Charles Darwin's colleagues in the British Museum. He was in his office one day and word got out that the British Parliament was thinking of selling the collections in the British Museum to make money. Wallace found he was over in the East Indies then, somewhere in Java, and he was just horrified by that. And it's worth reading for those of you in the back. The naturalist looks upon every species of animal and plant now living as the individual letters which go to make up one of the volumes of our Earth's history. And as a few lost letters may make a sentence unintelligible, so the extinction of numerous forms of the lost letters, or what the progress of cultivation invariably entails, will necessarily render obscure this invariable record of the past. It's therefore an important object to preserve them. If this is not done, if we don't care for these things, future generations will certainly look back upon us as a people so immersed Okay. Is therefore an important object to preserve them. If this is not done, future ages will certainly look back upon us as a people so immersed in the pursuit of wealth as to be blind to higher considerations. They will change us with having culpably allowed the destruction of some of these records of creation, which we had it in our power to preserve. And while professing to regard every living thing as a direct handiwork and best evidence of a creator, yet with the strangest inconsistency, seeing many of them perish irrecoverably from the face of the earth, uncared for and unknown. That was written in 1863. What Wallace would think right now, as we fight to save these little creatures by passing laws and hoping that the populace of the United States can understand this. This is why, we're having trouble now with the administration in Washington. But is it not too much to think that someone like President Trump, who spent his life making money selling real estate in Manhattan, could have any insight into the things that are so valuable to us here? It's almost impossible for him to do that. So we'll try to teach him, but he's not doing a very good job of learning. Well, okay. I'm not going to, that's politics for a night. So, okay. We have no trouble getting money to save things that are big and magnificent, such as the African lion. You know the money you need for that. But you go to take the little black-spotted toad, or red-spotted toad, which lives over in Saline Valley, in Willow Springs over there, and you go to a budget hearing, and these people will be saying, we can understand the lion. Why do you want to save a little black spotted toad for? Well, it's one of these things, again, if you have to ask a question, you won't understand the answer. And if you're really going to get laughed out of the auditorium, these are the hydrobiid snails, about the size of a pepper grind out of a pepper thing. They're about that size. You can see on a dime here how tiny they are. Yet these are probably better indications of evolution of life in the desert areas than any other one thing. You can walk down the Muir Trail from Donahue Pass, heading south, and you go to Gem Lake. You look up underneath Banner Peak there. You think, well, it's a pretty picture. But wouldn't it be a prettier picture if the tree were a little bit darker green and straighter? This is not the way I like to think of it. There are certain things that we just don't ask questions about. That's the same thing about the Mona Lisa, Da Vinci's famous painting there. I like the grin on her face. So what we have here then is a quest for excellence within ourselves. We're trying to work out the needs for biodiversity. E.L. Wilson there is the editor of this journal, and he's at Yale, or he was until recently. We have a new phase of science now called conservation biology. This wasn't even thought of when I was at Berkeley years ago, but now it's one of the big things in conservation, is the biology lying underneath the need for conservation. Education answers all these things. Ecological literacy, education and transition to a postmodern world. Got a good friend at Colorado State in Fort Collins, Holmes Ralston, who writes beautifully on the subject of environmental ethics. Biological Survey of the Nation, back in the Clinton years, we had a very fine Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall, who was most interested in educating the troops, such as I. Nowadays, you wouldn't get much of a response out of the Secretary of Interior. You'd be busy building soundproof booths. Okay. I knew I'd get a few chuckles. Okay, so we wonder about species. Here we have a good old watch, the old kind where you wind up, and you look at that and you think, what of these different items here in the back of the watch could we get rid of? No, we can't do this. This is a mainspring here. This gog gear runs the hands. Different jewels keep the thing functioning properly. So what this does then, it shows you in a finely tuned mechanism such as our environment that the different creatures therein must be retained. Leopold said it so well. To save all the parts is the first principle of intelligent tinkering. And unfortunately, this is what we've had to fight our way through. to have things that we will recognize as valuable without having them tinker with. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service down at Dexter Fish Hatchery and the Technology Center in New Mexico. Now we're trying to keep these different parts together and usable. And what we have here is a series of ponds where all of these different desert fishes are kept to keep their gene pools alive. And so that's what Dexter does, and it's a valuable thing to know that we have this. So if we do lose this part of that ecosystem, we can replace it. So all of a sudden, after we talked here for some time this evening, the difference between the old family Bible and the videotapes becomes obvious. One you can replace, the other you can't. So I think we're smart now with our Endangered Species programs, Endangered Species Act, to retain these things and disperse these others. It's interesting here, this graph, California population trends and resident angling license sales. Look here, 1950, where this started, with a population of only 10 million in California, it's about 4 times that now. We sold 1 million licenses. 10 years later, we sold 1.5 million licenses, about 1 out of every 10. 1970, we sold population of 20 million, we sold 2.1 million licenses. Then on down here to the most recent figure I have in the year 2000, of 35 million populations, nearly 40 now, and sold 1.3 million. But the important part is here. People are going to the mountains now for other reasons. Who's got a cell phone?
Darn technology.
Boy, see if I give any more talks here. But what this shows, though, okay, from 1 million to 2.3 million, that's 40 years ago now, down to 1.3 million in the year 2000. Shows that people are doing other things, in fishing anyway, than going out and catching a whole pile of fish. They're looking more deeply into things now. So I'm hoping that you go to the cleaning table at Crawley Lake at the opening weekend of the fishing season, that this young man here understands that when he's gutting out his trout, that fish had a right to live, and he has a right to eat it, of course, but only with a recognition of what this should mean to him. Albert Schweitzer, famous philosopher and natural, talks about reverence for life. And here we have the planet Earth. Some years ago, my wife gave me a book called The Home Planet. And it gave some of the statements by astronauts or cosmonauts as they flew around the planet and just looked at it. And this is written by Sigmund Jähn of the German Democratic Republic. Remember now, this is from the red side. Before I flew, I was already aware of how small and vulnerable our planet is. But only when I saw it from space in all its ineffable beauty and fragility did I realize that humankind's most urgent task is to cherish and preserve it for future generations. I think the astronauts tend to be, no matter if they're communist-backed or us, are pretty observant people. And I think for he coming from the Democratic Republic of the Soviet influence, where they view things very differently from us, this was furthermore most in Sigmund Jähn's mind of where we go from here. You know, we live in a great part of the world, don't we? I look at this picture of Mount Tom with the moon setting behind it, think, wow. Leopold put it this way: to promote perception is the only truly creative part of recreational engineering. That's beautifully put. This is the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service Training Center back in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And they teach people from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service the values of nature, and many of the things I teach here regularly. You go in there and you look out across this is the Commons area, this famous picture of Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir on Glacier Point. And boy, that says a lot right there. Can we do these things? Seem like overwhelming. Every man has only enough strength to complete those assignments of which he is fully convinced of their importance. That's Goethe, German philosopher, of course. So what we have to do then, we realize these things are terribly important. The best thing we can do is to let that motivation manifest itself in what we do every day. I had this quote above my desk for my entire career, which pushes 50 years now, by Ben Franklin, and made it in 1770. My rule, of which I've always found satisfaction, is never to turn aside in public affairs through views of private interest, but to go straight forward in doing what appears to me right at the time, leaving the consequences with Providence. How true that is. It's a beautiful statement. I think everybody in Washington, D.C. should read that every day. Golden trout work. Done a lot of work on golden trout, not only pupfish. We come back to Aldo Leopold, famous land ethic again. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. That's a beautiful statement there. If it's right biologically, it's okay. If it's not, you don't do it. So I'll end the talk tonight with this statement at the beginning, because of the work that we do, there's never an end to it. It's something we pick up and run with it and fight as hard as you can fight to save that environment for whatever needs the future may have. So I appreciate your attention this evening. I'll be around to answer questions as long as you like to stay around. So thank you for your attention.
Questions for Phil?
Yeah.
So in a sense, we can guess you're preaching to the choir tonight because we're all here. What ideas do you have for gently educating others to begin to think more ethically about how we live on this planet?
How to do that? There you're going deeply into a person's values. And I think the best way you can do it is say, what if you woke up in the morning and there were no birds in the trees? No animals walking around, no plants. You begin to see that we're dependent on all these things. And I think that'd be about the best way I could explain it. A lot of it comes from deep within you. You can tell that. There's no real easy way to answer that question, except that you have to live it every day. Anything else? Well, I appreciate your kind attention. You can stay here as long as you want, or you can go home.
Thanks, Phil.